How is everybody? John took one look at this room and he said, man, we have to move to Seattle. This is great.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, today is a very special day for me, and I want to tell you why, if I could. This is the 25th anniversary, this week, of the greatest concert I ever went to in my entire life. I was just a shade under 12 years old. I was growing up in New York City, and I got tickets to go to Madison Square Garden to see Run DMC. And the opening act that night is a group you might have heard of. They hadn't even dropped an album yet, but Run DMC put them out there because they were on their label, a group called the Beastie Boys. And the Beastie Boys came out there, and the Beastie Boys have skills, but nobody in Madison Square Garden wanted to hear the Beastie Boys. So they started throwing things at the Beastie Boys. They yelled at the Beastie Boys to get off the stage, because people were there to see Run DMC. Now, why do I tell you this story? I am well aware that you are here tonight to see Run DMC. And I am your resident Beastie Boy. But I will try to keep my comments brief so John can get on the mic. It's so great to be at this museum, but as John and I have been traveling around the country with this book, we haven't just been going to museums and bookstores. We've made a point to go to every occupation site in this country as part of Occupy USA. And when we go there, it's amazing, it's always amazing, to see people born years, no, decades after that 1968 moment get so excited to see John and get so excited to hear what John has to say. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense why. I mean, that moment in 1968, that image from 1968 is such an image of defiance, such an electric moment of do what you must, but I will stand for what I believe in. I'm going to be bold no matter what price I might have to pay. It's no wonder that people are still attracted to it. And then, of course, the issues that they were fighting for at that time, for racial and economic justice, obviously, those are not issues that we have achieved at this point in American history. We are not done with those fights. And John speaks to that very directly at Occupy Wall Street. At the very first time we went to an Occupy site, John stood up at the General Assembly and he said, I'm here for you. Why? Because I am you. I'm here because 43 years later, the fight has not yet been won. We're not here for ourselves, but for our children to come. And it had a powerful resonance with every person there. And we are thrilled, to be perfectly clear, that that moment from 1968 still connects with people so strongly. But we wrote this book, the John Carlos story, because we want to set the record straight. We want to end the historical whitewash, and we want to let people know that it was more than just a moment. It was a movement. More than a moment, it was a movement called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. We want people to know that in the 1960s, which these days seems to only get recognized when McDonald's puts Dr. King on a commemorative cup, actually was something much broader, much deeper, and much more radical. So radical that it even galloped into the world of sports, to the point of which the top athletes in the world were also part of the struggle. You look at basketball. Who was the best basketball player at that time? You could argue it was Bill Russell. Bill Russell, part of the struggle. Who was the best college basketball player? Lou Alcindor. Lou Alcindor, part of the struggle. Best football player, Jim Brown, part of the struggle. The best of everything, Muhammad Ali. Part of the struggle. And of course, a couple of years later, this merging of sports and politics exploded in women's sports. People like Billie Jean King, Lacey O'Neal, Donna DeVerona. It made sense for people that as long as you had this hyper-exalted platform, you were going to say something about the world and about injustice. And this movement exploded in the world of track and fields and exploded into the Olympic Games in the form of the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Now, it was a movement, and they had 4 demands that they were making of the International Olympic Committee. 4 demands that they said, you better meet these demands, or every single African-American track star will not show up to the 1968 Olympics. We will not go unless our concerns are met. And what a powerful thing that was to say. It's like, let's see how those medal counts look without black athletes. Not so good. As they said in their founding statement, why should we run in Mexico only to crawl home? And their 4 demands are not just beautiful to me, but prescient, ahead of their time. These were their demands. 1, and these were so controversial at the time, but now you're going to hear these and be like, yeah? But one of their demands, restore Muhammad Ali's boxing title. Muhammad Ali had his boxing title stripped for his opposition to the war in Vietnam. They said Muhammad Ali is the warrior saint of the black athletes' revolt. 2, disinvite South Africa and Rhodesia from the Olympic Games. These are apartheid countries and they have no place on the Olympic field. 3, hire more African-American coaches. U.S. track and field team dominated by black athletes. You know what? The number of African-American coaches, if you tried to count them on 2 fingers, you'd be at 1 too many. There was just 1. And their last demand, and this is where they openly, consciously, and brazenly just stepped in the crosshairs, was they said Avery Brundage has to go as the head of the International Olympic Committee. Now, for those of you clapping, you realize not only how just that was, but how daring that was. I mean, Avery Brundage was the head of the IOC. He was the most powerful person in Olympic sports. He also just happened to be an open fascist. He was the person who delivered the Olympics in 1936 to Hitler's Germany. He was a white supremacist. He was somebody who was so out there, if Rick Perry was around back then, he would have been like, damn, you're crazy. And he also was incredibly powerful in the Olympic movement. And these guys said, you know what? He's got to go. So they came up with this plan for the boycott. Now, the boycott fell through. And it fell through really for 2 reasons. One of those reasons was very good. The IOC caved and for the first time ever withdrew their invitations to South Africa and Rhodesia. The pressure worked. The goals worked. The movement worked. But the second reason is more complicated. I mean, and this always comes up when it's about trying to get athletes to actually do something for social justice. Far too many people said, gosh, I've been training my whole life for this one moment, for that 10 seconds, those 20 seconds on the track. I got to chase that carrot. I can't give it up. And so the boycott fell through. And at this point, people like John Carlos, Tommie Smith, Lee Evans, they were faced with a choice. The choice was, well, do we just stay home anyway in the absence of a broader movement? Or do we go there and actually represent our movement on the medal stand? And we know what they chose. So before the final race in the 200 meters, John Carlos and Tommie Smith got together. And they said, okay, what are we going to do on this medal stand? Well, we're going to wear black gloves to show our commitment to fighting racism. We're not going to wear shoes on that medal stand to showcase the fact that we are bringing up the issue of poverty in the African-American community, people who can't even afford shoes. We're going to wear beads around our necks to showcase the history of violence and lynching against people of African descent. And John Carlos, and you can see it in this picture, in an incredible breach of protocol, decided he was going to be up there with his jacket unzipped and with the USA on his chest covered by a black t-shirt. And he said he was doing that as a tribute to his people back home, white and black, working people, who he said their appreciations were not appreciated in US society. So they came up with this great idea that they were going to do this. Of course, there was one thing they had to do first. What'd they have to do? They had to win. I mean, it would be a pretty awful story if they came in 9th. And we're like, oh man, we brought these beads and gloves for nothing. You know, far less inspiring a story. And here is where John Carlos engaged himself in what I think is one of the most dazzling feats of athletic pyrotechnics ever, and also one of the most transgressive and rebellious feats ever. And people should go back and look at this race, and you'll see what John Carlos did. I mean, John Carlos at this time was, in my opinion, the fastest person on earth. He was running 100 yards in under 9 seconds. Any track and field people here, you can testify that that's good. It was a world record. He could run 200 meters in under 20 seconds. It was amazing. And so John Carlos kicks off on this race, but his mind isn't thinking, I got to cross that line first. I got to get the gold. His mind is thinking, I have to figure out how to pace this race so Tommie and me are on this medal stand. So people go on YouTube, you should watch it. And you'll see John Carlos repeat